Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Education Policy 101. My name is Christina Pretorius, and I am the Policy Director with Reaching Higher New Hampshire. A little bit about Reaching Higher. We are a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that serves as a public education policy resource and engagement center. Our goal is to make sure that New Hampshire families, students, and communities, as well as the elected representatives who serve them, have access to data-driven analysis to aid in their decision making. Today, we will be giving a brief update of the overhaul to the minimum standards for public school approval, affectionately known as the ED 306s. We'll be giving a profile of New Hampshire students in schools. We'll give an overview of policy changes that have happened both in the 2024 legislative session and in the previous few years and how that's shaped the educational landscape in New Hampshire. We'll talk about what's ahead for the state and what we're thinking about and what we would expect for 2025, which is coming up very quickly as it is nearly September. And then we will end with a Q&A section. For folks who are watching the recording, feel free to email me if you have any questions. My email is christina@reachinghighernh.org. That information will be available at the end, but our staff is always available for questions, for conversation, or anything like that. So please feel free to reach out. So with that, we're going to start with a minimum standards update. And before we get into what's happened over the past few weeks, we're going to just give a brief overview of what are the minimum standards for public school approval. So these are the foundational rules for all public schools in New Hampshire. They are the rules that are adopted by the Department of Education and by the State Board of Education to implement state law around what makes a public school a public school. What are the requirements for public schools? The rules are one of the most important ways that the state can ensure that all students, regardless of where they live or which public school they attend, are receiving a baseline education. These minimum standards set the expectations for every school in the state to make sure that every student has access to a high quality public education. They have a really broad scope. They include things like school board policy requirements, regulations around culture and climate, rules around instructional resources, assessment, staff qualification, even down to food and nutrition services, and a whole host of other areas. So these standards are extremely broad. They take into account a lot of the different elements of public schools, but they are absolutely critical to ensure, like I said before, that all students who attend public schools receive a high quality education, regardless of where that is. One of the other really important things about the minimum standards for public school approval is that these are requirements from the state. So this really comes into play when also we talk about the issue of school funding. So the state is required, as has been set out in state law and through a number of different court rulings, that what the state mandates for its public schools is what it has to pay for. And so these minimum standards, by setting them, it's saying that the state values these. This is what we want for our public schools, and so now we have to step up and pay for it. And so as the state continues to talk about school funding, these minimum standards become really important in that conversation as well. So in late 2020, the New Hampshire Department of Education began overhauling the minimum standards for public school approval. It is a requirement that every 10 years, the agency does have to revisit the minimum standards to make sure they are keeping up with the latest in what we know for what works for our students and for our schools. And so the overhaul that began in late 2020 and really started in earnest in 2021 has been a very long process. We recently, in the past couple of years, began to see where the department was thinking of taking the minimum standards, and in a number of analyses, Reaching Higher's team has found that the New Hampshire Department of Education's proposal could really redefine the vision and role of public schools in New Hampshire and could ultimately lower standards for public schools. So this overhaul would weaken requirements for curriculum and for programs. It does a number of things that are pretty nuanced, but would have really large effects in the implementation of them. So it would replace courses with learning opportunities, which the public was very concerned about, which state attorneys were pretty concerned about in terms of the fiscal impact of that. So right now, the minimum standards require schools to offer courses in the required subject areas. The overhaul would replace that with learning opportunities, which is a very vague term. There was a lot of questions around what is a learning opportunity. What would that require schools to actually do? What would it require the state to actually pay for? So this one was a one that was pretty far ranging in terms of the concerns around it. The overhaul would also eliminate class size requirements. So right now, New Hampshire has requirements in terms of how many students can be in a classroom at one time. For younger students, it's in the 20 to 25 student area. For older students, that's closer to 25 and 30. And so, a school cannot have beyond those number of students, and that's really important when we think about student teacher ratio, the attention that individual students receive to make sure that they're making progress and that they are learning what they're supposed to. The overhaul actually eliminates those class size requirements. Instead, it puts in a broader ratio, which could mean that we have larger classes. For younger students, that could mean 30, 40 second graders in a classroom. For older students, it could mean, a college style lecture, which raises a lot of questions, and it's raised a lot of concerns among educators, among child learning experts, among parents too, have been really concerned with this elimination. There's been a lot of changes around the alternative programs. These are programs that school districts approve and ultimately have to pay for. These are programs that are outside of the public school curriculum. And so there have been number of changes there that may have some fiscal impacts. The overhaul removes the requirements to meet instructional needs of students, which was a really big concern because right now there is that requirement. It's set in the rules. And having that removed was something that raised a lot of concern among the public. And then ultimately, altogether, they really lower the expectations for student learning. One of the most prominent ways that this is done through there is it takes mastery of content and turns that into an aspiration rather than a requirement. So under current law, students have to master their content before they can move on to more advanced content. And so, it ensures that they know everything about the subject. They have that baseline knowledge before they move on to something else. The New Hampshire Department of Education's overhaul would lower that to be proficient and would set mastery of the content to something aspirational. And the rules actually say, we should aspire for mastery. And so that really lowers the expectations that we have for our students. And there's been a lot of concern around what that means for students and for their learning. So one thing that Reaching Higher continually looks at, because we've done a number of analyses, we've engaged with a number of folks on these issues, and the one thing that we really do keep in mind as we go is do these changes align with what we know about a high quality education? And so this graphic here has to do with a whole child education. It is best practices for ensuring that students receive a holistic education, um, and it talks about some of the elements of a high quality education. And so when we look at the rules, one of the big questions that we regularly ask is, does this set up public schools where children can learn, grow, and thrive? And one of the things that we've seen, that we've analyzed, is that there are a number of potential outcomes here. And one of the biggest ones is that it would shift the role of the public school from places of teaching and learning to really credit approving centers. And it does that by shifting the emphasis away from teaching and learning, away from that high quality instruction, and really towards certifying students' collections of competency statements. And so there, does that move it to more of sort of a checkbox of like, sure, you did that, you did that, you did that, and really de-emphasizing that high quality teaching and learning that we know advances student learning. There have also been a number of questions among the public around the role of privatization and how far this overhaul goes in the dismantling of public schools. So under the rule proposal, public schools would really have little control over the quality and depth of the curriculum and instruction, and it could actually create a market for external credit-bearing opportunities. So these for-profit organizations to sell credits, while removing the school's authority to vet those programs and make sure that they align with the school's curriculum. So what does this look like in practice? It could mean something like an organization, a for-profit organization comes in, sells a social studies program. A student takes that social studies program, their parent pays, and then that student goes to their public school and says, I took this program and now you have to give me credit for it. And that school would be required to do so, even if that social studies program didn't align with the curriculum of their school, even if it wasn't to the same caliber, if it wasn't as rigorous as that school's social studies program, they would still be required to offer that credit. And so there are a lot of questions around that here. There was a lot of pushback in the public comment around, is this in the best interest of our students? Is this in the best interest of our communities? What will this do to our public schools? Granite Staters really value our public education system. It's one of the top ones in the nation, and there was a lot of concern around what this would do to it. The State Board of Education has approved their final proposal for one section for the first half, which is a large chunk of the minimum standards. They will now go to a legislative oversight committee where the committee will look at, do the changes align with state law? Will they be able to be uniformly applied? Are they in the best interest of the public, and those kinds of things? And so that meeting is scheduled for September 19th. We do expect the minimum standards to be on that agenda. And so we will have a lot more information, and we'll be following this really closely at that point. So if you're interested in this topic, I know that this was really fast. There was a lot here, but feel free to email me if you want updates. We send out a regular newsletter on developments, and we will, of course, be covering any developments on our website and on our social media pages. And so with that, we are going to move into the profile of New Hampshire students and schools. First, we wanted to look at the evolving educational landscape in New Hampshire. In our state, we have public schools that are operated by local school boards and are subject to state laws and standards, those minimum standards that I had talked about. We have charter schools that are operated by boards of trustees and are approved by our State Board of Education. We have private and religious schools that are privately owned and must be approved by the state. And we also have a number of students who are homeschooled. They register with either the state or their local school district, and they're able to do their home education. And then we have these emerging models. We have micro schools and we have learning centers. These models, while they're not completely new, have come into the spotlight even more with our state's school voucher program, because we see a significant amount of money going to these types of programs. Micro schools and learning centers, they're not official schools, and therefore they don't have to abide by any of the laws or rules that pertain to public, charter, or even private schools. They don't have to follow any of the standards that public schools and charter schools have to follow, even though they do receive funding from the state through school vouchers. They are models that have grown quite a bit as the school voucher programs have taken off in states, including in New Hampshire. And so we just wanted to make folks aware that the educational landscape is evolving and changing, especially with the passage of the school voucher program. However, it is important to know that despite the various models of education in New Hampshire, the vast majority of students attend a public school. About 9 in 10 students go to a public school. About 3% of students attend one of the 30 plus charter schools, and about 9% of students attend a private school. About 2% of the students in New Hampshire are homeschooled. It's important to note here that most families choose their local public schools when deciding for the best fit for their child. In fact, 9 in 10 local families report that their public schools create an environment that helps their children learn, according to a recent survey from the New Hampshire Department of Education. So we continually see families choosing their public schools for their children. So the vast majority of students attend a public school, but it is important to know that the number of students in public schools is declining. So in 2014, there are about 177,000 public school students in a K through 12 school. In 2023, that number dropped to about 155,000. There has been a pretty steady drop of about 1% in the number of students in public schools for really about 2 decades now. That enrollment drop is pretty consistent. It did escalate a little bit during the pandemic, but we continue to see post pandemic that 1% drop. There are a number of reasons for this. The largest reason is just simply the demographic changes in New Hampshire. There are fewer school-aged children in New Hampshire. Our population is growing, but the population tends to grow in the older age brackets. There just aren't as many children in New Hampshire. There have been declining birth rates. A number of families have moved out of this state for a number of reasons. There, in the past decade, and between about 2010 and 2020, there was about 11% drop in the total number of residents under the age of 18 statewide. It is important to know that the number of students who were enrolled in public schools is declining. We're also seeing similar trends, and we've been seeing similar trends in private schools and in homeschooling as well. So it's important to know that, just because we're seeing these large drops in some areas doesn't mean that these students are leaving and going to different areas, to different educational options. There are just simply fewer students in New Hampshire. So even though the number of students is steadily declining, we do see an increase in student needs. So we see an increase in the percentage of students who are navigating poverty. That's which we measure by the number of students who are participating in school meals. That percentage has increased about 30% between 2013 and 2024. The number of students who are receiving special education services has increased about 25% in that same period. And the percentage of students who are receiving English language learner services in their schools has increased about 50% in that same time period. So we're seeing, even though there may be slightly fewer students, these students have greater needs, and that has significant implications for public schools in creating environments where all students can thrive. I would also like to note that New Hampshire's student population is growing more diverse. In the last decade, the number of school aged youth has declined by about 11%, as we had mentioned earlier, but the number of youth of color in the state has increased by 48%, according to studies from the University of New Hampshire. This has really important implications when we think about our public schools, school culture, curriculum, and the teaching profession, since students learn best when their learning materials, when their education reflects their experiences, and they have a strong and supportive school environment. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about school funding in New Hampshire. The state, this is a topic that has been an issue and a discussion point for decades now. Right now, the current school funding formula provides about an average of $6,768 per student. That is a per student funding. So every public school student in New Hampshire um, is is about $4,100, and that's in what's called base adequacy. Schools get additional funding for students navigating poverty, and that's measured by students who participate in school meal programs. That's about $2,300. The schools receive additional funding for students who are receiving special education services and for students who are receiving English language learner services. So that's the per student funding. There's also targeted funding, and that totals about $179 million per year. This targeted funding is concentrated in high need school districts based on their concentrations of students navigating poverty and in their property wealth. So school districts get the most funding under this formula when they have high concentrations of students navigating poverty and relatively low property tax bases. And then there's also a $50 million hold harmless funding. In this past budget cycle, the legislature changed the school funding formula a little bit. And so, in order to sort of ease the transition into this new funding formula, they do have this what's called hold harmless funding so that districts didn't lose any money in a sharp way from one year to the next. That funding stream does phase out over a number of years. So when we look at where school funding comes from, the vast majority of school funding in the state comes from local property taxes. About a quarter of it is from the state of New Hampshire. That's through business taxes, the lottery, real estate transfer taxes, a number of other state-wide taxes. But the vast majority of state funding comes from local property taxes. The state does get usually between 5 and 10% from the federal government. Over the past few years, this slice has been larger because of significant federal investments in states because of the COVID pandemic. New Hampshire has received several $100 million of state federal relief funding over the past few years. That money is winding down in 2024. But that percentage has been a little bit higher since 2021, but we would expect that to shrink a little bit as that money phases out. So, one thing to know about school funding in New Hampshire, and particularly the reliance on local property taxes, is that that means that there is very wide disparities in the amount per student that school districts have. As you can see in Auburn, the average cost per pupil is about $14,000. In Newcastle, it's close to $42,000, and that's due to a number of factors. So there are a number of things at play when we think about cost per pupil. There is the size of the district. There is the location of the district. There are the various expenses, and they really vary geographically. One piece that really varies quite a bit is transportation. And so that's really important to know. Um, but one of the other large drivers of the disparity in the cost per pupil, how much schools have to educate, is that ability for their local districts to raise the funding. So that they need to operate their public schools. And so, we see communities who have really high tax rates, but because of their property valuations, they're not able to raise as much for their public schools. So that has pretty significant implications in how their schools operate, in the opportunities that they can give to their students. Um, and so this has really been a a pressure point for the state. We are hearing a lot about it, a lot of concern, a lot of activism around public school funding in the state, and really calling for more equity in how funds are distributed and how that money is given out. We do know that school funding is directly related to student opportunities and student outcomes, and so this is really important when we think about what do we want for our public schools. We want high quality public schools, so we need to resource them. So public school funding has been an issue in New Hampshire for decades, as I had said. It was recently ruled by a Superior Court judge that New Hampshire underfunds its public schools by $500 million every year. And so this results in education quality that really varies by zip code. Some districts are able to offer certain programs or operate their schools in a certain way. Um, and it has also had significant impacts on our teaching profession. So we see teacher shortages. We see other things that are more pronounced in some districts than others. But I think it's really important to note here that courts have found that our public schools are underfunded by about over $500 million every single year. So we know the research shows us that adequate, sustainable, and responsible school funding is critical to ensuring that all students receive a high quality education. Decades of research has shown that when funding is allocated responsibly and targeted to communities that need it the most, that student outcomes improve. We have seen substantial improvements in math and reading achievement, reductions in grade repetition, reductions in suspensions and expulsions, an increased likelihood of high school graduation and students being college ready. So this is well documented, that school funding has a direct relationship with student outcomes, and so that's why this issue is so critical when we think about what is our vision for our public schools and what do we want for our students. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about an overview of the policy changes that have happened both in this past year in 2024 and in the past few years. There have been a number of policy changes that have reshaped education in New Hampshire. So in recent years, we've seen three key themes emerge from lawmakers from the State House. We've seen persistently underfunded public schools, as we said. We've seen changes in funding formulas, but that didn't really address the heart of the matter. We see school districts and towns adopting tax caps that contribute to that pinch. Since 2021, lawmakers have pursued privatization efforts in the form of school vouchers. These are known as education freedom accounts in New Hampshire, but whatever they are called, they are school vouchers, and that allows families to receive the state funding to use for private and religious school tuition, for homeschool expenses, or for a number of different things. So we've also seen a number of different efforts to redefine public education in the areas of curriculum and assessment, in school climate and inclusivity. That includes things like divisive concepts, like book bans and those kinds of things. And we've also seen a number of bills around the teaching profession. So, one of the bills that was passed and signed by the governor this past year in 2024 was Senate Bill 383, having to do with school budget caps. Senate Bill 383 would allow school district voters to adopt a budget cap that imposes a maximum dollar amount that their school boards could propose for the school year, regardless of the school needs. School district voters could adopt the budget cap with a 3/5 supermajority vote and could override the budget cap in any given year with that 3/5 supermajority vote. So there are likely some folks who are familiar with tax caps, which do require decision makers to adopt budgets that would limit the tax impact. A budget cap is similar, but it caps the total amount that the school board can budget for the year, regardless of any revenue sources or needs that it has. So a tax cap may take into account, a school receives additional funds from the state or from the federal government, or they get a philanthropic grant that could impact that tax cap. This is just simply the budgeted amount. So it does not take into account those revenue sources. To calculate the budget under this bill, the district takes a per student cost for a given year and multiplies it by the student enrollment and by a predetermined inflationary factor. I want to emphasize that we've heard that this formula could create an environment where budget decisions wouldn't be responsive to the needs of the students in that year. It effectively locks in the student demographics of that beginning year and carries that indefinitely. So that per student cost takes into account the number and need of students who receive special education services that year. It takes into account the programming and curriculum costs of that year, the technology costs of that year, all of those kinds of things. And it carries that over indefinitely for as long as that budget cap is in existence. The formula does not take into account contractual obligations, special education, or other mandatory requirements. So, for one example, and we'll use a perennial example that school boards have to grapple with every year, staff health insurance costs. If those health insurance costs increase more than the inflationary factor, which historically it has, that difference may have to be made up by cutting student programs, by cutting staff, or some other way. They have to account for that increase in some other place. In addition, it makes the school budget pretty volatile by being so heavily based on enrollment. So, for example, even if 5 students leave the district in 1 year, that could mean that the school board may have to cut the following year's budget by $100,000, even if they have different revenue sources. Regardless of the needs of their students, they would still have to cut that because of that enrollment drop. There was a lot of public testimony when this concept was brought forward in the last biennium that it doesn't solve the problem of inequitable and inadequate school funding, and it could actually limit a school district's ability to accept state, federal, and philanthropic grants, and could significantly impact the school's ability to provide an adequate education to all of its students. Another bill that was passed this year is House Bill 1265, and that's the mandatory reporting of expenditures. And so this bill would require school districts to publish the average cost per pupil over the past 10 years, the average teacher salary over the past 10 years, the annual total of their administrator salaries, and the salaries of their 4 highest paid school administrators. This takes effect next year, but this data would have to be posted and made available for voters by the school district It's important to know that all of this data and more is available on the Department of Education's website for anyone to see. They have these really interesting tools where you can compare various different variables and that kind of thing. But this bill will go into effect in 2025, and may have an impact on school district budgeting. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about bills that may not have passed, but um, are bills that, they either perennially come up, they keep coming up in hopes that their sponsors can get them passed, or that, even if a bill isn't passed, it does still have an impact on the public schools, and how we operate. So one of the policy ideas that has been continually brought up has to do with curriculum and assessment. So there have been continued efforts to redefine and dilute the requirements for public schools in what they have to offer. So in 2022, this emerged as House Bill 1671. In 2024, it reemerged as House Bill 1691. And so these bills would have stripped the required course areas, the required subject areas of an adequate education to really the to really just four: math, English language arts, science, and social studies. House Bill 1671 would have just flat out eliminated art, health, world language, physical education, engineering, computer science, and made them more interdisciplinary subjects and wouldn't have required public schools to offer them as standalone. House Bill 1691 softened the language a little bit, but did have the same effect, where those art, health, world language wouldn't be, quote, emphasized, but instead schools would just have to pay attention to. And so what we're seeing here is this attempt to really redefine what public schools are and what they offer. There have also been a number of efforts around school climate and inclusivity. Governor Sununu recently signed several LGBTQ bills into law. Um, those are incredibly impactful and um, and really impact students' senses of inclusion and belonging in schools. There have also been a number of proposed bills that would prohibit inclusivity. Um, there are subpoena bills that were proposed that would allow the Department of Education to subpoena teachers when they suspect a violation of the code of conduct. There was also a bill that would ban social emotional learning in public schools. That was House Bill 1473. That those bills did fail. There was a very strong turnout against these bills, particularly against the social emotional learning ban. But we do expect these to be reproposed in 2025 and beyond. When we think about the teaching profession, there has been some movement there legislatively. In 2022, a legislative committee found that there is, in fact, a statewide teacher shortage, and that it's largely driven by inadequate pay, by challenging working conditions, and by the statewide political climate. Lawmakers have proposed a number of bills, some that would invest money in teacher recruitment and retention programs. Several of those bills have passed, but were not funded, so they have like $1 in the budget line. So that is one thing that we can expect to see in the 2025 legislative year, because it is a budget year. So funding those recruitment and retention programs. But there have also been efforts to undermine the teaching profession by removing licensure and certification requirements for teachers who teach part-time. And so we're seeing these sort of competing efforts On the one hand, diluting the requirements for teachers. On the other hand, investing in recruitment and retention programs like loan forgiveness, like induction programs, like mentorship, and those kinds of things. So we did want to take a couple of minutes to talk about some emerging topics in education in New Hampshire. One of the big emerging topics is AI in the classroom. So um, the Department of Education did enter into a contract with Khan Academy's program, Khanmigo, which is an AI generated tool that is now available to classrooms across New Hampshire. Um, AI in schools is a topic that's being talked about nationally. It has a lot of promise, and there are also a number of concerns around what it would mean for students, what it means for privacy, and all of those kinds of things. So that's something that we're watching pretty closely. It's a really interesting topic, and one that will probably have pretty substantial impacts on student learning in the coming years. Another emerging topic has to do with local control. And this topic is really hot off the press. This summer, a school district has filed a court motion to stop the requirement that they enter into a tuition agreement, and that requirement was put forth by the State Board of Education. And so now there is this question of what is the role of the State Board of Education and what authority do they have to require local school districts to enter into tuition agreements with any schools, but with this particular issue had to do with a tuition agreement with a private religious school in their area. And so there is this emerging conversation around what is the State Board of Education's authority in those local decisions. Another emerging topic has to do with that federal pandemic relief funding. So New Hampshire schools have received quite a bit of funding to help meet student needs through the pandemic. One important thing to know is that students are still being affected by the pandemic. As this is an article from the Washington Post this past week that talks about students really still feeling the effects of the pandemic. That it's still being reflected in their student learning. They still need support to fully recover from those learning disruptions. However, that federal funding is phasing out, and so will districts be able to continue the supports that they were able to give students despite that loss in federal funding? What roles do states have in ensuring that schools can continue to provide the supports that students need on an ongoing basis, even as that federal funding phases out? So now we're going to shift gears and talk about what's ahead for New Hampshire. What can we expect in 2025, this upcoming legislative session? So it is a budget year. And so that work is actually starting relatively soon, with agencies starting to draft their individual budgets. That begins this fall. When we're thinking about process wise, the governor proposes a state budget, and that's released in February, usually around Valentine's Day. So happy Valentine's Day to everyone who's involved in the budget process. The House phase is from February to April. Then it gets handed over to the Senate for work in April through June. And then if there is disagreement between the House and Senate, they go to what's called a committee of conference in June, where small work groups come together to kind of iron out the details and come to compromises so that the state can pass a budget that goes into effect on July 1st. Our budgets are 2-year budgets. They're biennial budgets. So this will be for July 1st, 2025 through June 30th, 2027. As you can imagine, once February hits and there is that governor's proposal, things move extremely quickly. It is a very busy time of year. There are a lot of developments and movement, and so for folks who are interested in the state budget process, I would highly encourage you to sign up for Reaching Higher's newsletter. Follow us on social media. And there are also other organizations that are really heavily involved in the budget process. I would shout out to my friends at the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. They do an incredible job of tracking and following the budget process and what's happening. So in terms of specific legislation that we can expect in 2025, there are a number of things. School funding is one that we would for sure expect. It's a perennial issue. So we would expect to see some school funding bills. We would expect to see some proposed legislation around the school voucher program, expansion of school vouchers, and also in the past few years, we've seen efforts to increase the transparency and the accountability of the program, so accountability to taxpayers. And so we would probably expect to see some of those bills reproposed as well. There are efforts to increase school meal access that we're expecting. As I said before, bills around the teaching profession, from funding those teacher recruitment and retention programs to other efforts around the teaching profession. We would expect to see more culture war issues, and those are largely driven by national forces, whether that's book bans, bills affecting LGBTQ students, families, and teachers. Unfortunately, those are pieces that we would probably expect to see again. We would probably expect, just based on past history, further efforts to gut the requirements of an adequate education, since we've been seeing those pop up in the past couple of years. We would expect to see a number of pieces of legislation around math and reading instruction, and we could even see some bills around AI in the classroom. We've been seeing that nationally, that there's been a couple of movements around lawmakers trying to grapple, what is the role of AI in the classroom and how can the state ensure that they are keeping students safe. So I do want to emphasize that, um, despite a changing landscape, despite the past couple of years where we've seen, some eroding support among decision makers for public education with the introduction of school vouchers and all of those kind of bills and efforts, we have seen an unprecedented level of engagement from Granite Staters in supporting their public schools. So, we've seen this from local school board areas to even the State Board of Education. Their meetings have become standing room only. There's a continuous stream of letters to the editor in support of public schools. The amount of public comments has skyrocketed. Thousands of people turn out in support of their public schools throughout the legislative session, at the State Board of Education, at their local school board meetings. And so it's been really inspiring. And it's something that I really like to remind people of, policy updates, especially in these times where education is such a politically volatile issue, unfortunately. And there are some troubling efforts at the state level. We know that Granite Staters truly value their public education system, their public schools, and so that's been really, really important and absolutely inspiring. And with that, we'd like to thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. My name is Christina Pretorius. My email there is christina@reachinghighernh.org, but please feel free to reach out to any of us. Feel free to follow us on social media. Our website is there, and we do send out a regular newsletter with updates like this. So please reach out anytime you have any questions or want to talk about this work. Thank you so much.